Chapter 5. A Marriage Made in Hell. Back in the 1960s, you'd have thought I was the happiest guy in the world. I wasn't, although that had nothing to do with my 4 bright, happy children. Contrary to Loretta's prediction about how the relationship would improve after we were married, things only got worse. Honestly, it was a house of horrors for me and for Loretta, too. Arguments were a daily occurrence. They became such a regular part of my life that when I look back, they blur. On some occasions, however, things went beyond words. Both Loretta and I were products of the Pennsylvania coal region of the 1940s and 1950s. It was a blue-collar area with blue-collar mores. The upside is that people were hard-working, for the most part honest and good neighbors. The downside is that many were alcoholics, and domestic disputes were often settled with violence. I remember being up in my 3rd-story bedroom as a kid and hearing a woman on the street below saying to her coal miner boyfriend, "I love you, I love you," even as I could hear his fists punching her body. It pains me to admit it now, and I regret ever doing it, but there were times when I punched Loretta. I never slapped or hit her in the face, but still sometimes I did strike her. I might punch her in the arm or push her away when she was getting on me. She threw things at me, pots, pans, a pot of boiling coffee once. After a fight, I would think, Jesus Christ, this is no way to live. For the most part, though, we just fought with words. Loretta passed away several years ago, so she cannot provide her perspective. I can say only that I would bring up something, and nearly always she would oppose it. I would say something like, "I'm going to clean out the garage this weekend." Her response would be, "Oh, no, you don't want to do that. I need you to do such and such." And it would escalate from there. I felt nagged because she would get on me about totally unrelated things. Our voices would rise, and I would become more and more upset. Many, many times, too many to count, I wound up feeling utterly deflated. I would sink down in my chair with my head in my hands, thinking, this is ruining my life. Why do I let this happen? At those moments, the strangest thing would happen. Loretta would calm down, too, and say, "Here, Ron, let me make you a cup of coffee. Here's a piece of pie." It was as if she had won the argument. And she had, because many times I felt exhausted and defeated. We would be out in public, and she would just snap and start yelling at me, which was embarrassing as hell. The default state of our marriage was strife. I do not bring that up to paint myself as the henpecked husband or a victim. Were Loretta still alive, she undoubtedly could fill in the other side of the story. Suffice it to say, it takes 2 to tango, and we both contributed mightily. It boils down to, and I think this occurs in many relationships, an inability to tolerate the way the other person is. One person is holding an attitude about the other of, "I think you should be this way. I think you shouldn't be that way. I think you should do this. I think you shouldn't do that." A list of attributes that don't exist in the other person, but should, in the other person's opinion. The second person holds a similar attitude about the first, and so they enter an arena of combativeness that has no reason to exist, except for an unwillingness to tolerate the person who is right there. Yet if one could overcome that unwillingness, one might find that those intolerable things in the other person might fade away. That is actually what happened in my marriage to Loretta in later years. An important detail of a larger point of the story is that we did not hide these spats from the children. They were witness to them, and I know they were scared. Just as I was when my mother and father used to fight back in Mount Carmel. My mother might get on my father about something, and he would erupt. He never struck her, but sometimes he picked up a dish towel to lash her with. They would be screaming at each other, and witnessing their fights was traumatic for me. I depended on my parents for survival. Today I regret that Loretta and I exposed our children to those fights. Anyone who has known our son David as an adult can recognize some of the elements from those battles: the volatile temper, the refusal to let go of things, and the tendency to try to dominate through nullification. Yet who can say for certain whether these tendencies were part of David's makeup from birth, or they were learned? Because none of my other children expresses these traits, I am inclined to think that they were latent in him from the beginning. While I believe that Loretta and I shaped the lives of our children to a degree, each of our children makes their own decisions. Ronnie, for instance, is the most considerate and thoughtful person you would ever want to meet. Yet he was exposed to as many of our fights as the others, more even because he is the oldest. I guess every child processes what happens in the home in their own way, since they turn out so differently. The truth, however, is that Loretta's antagonism was really directed only at me. She was great with the kids. She cooked their food and made sure they were dressed well for school. She demanded that they do well in class and get good grades. She was nice to the neighbors. She was a good cook and homemaker. Her lasagna was tremendous, really, really good. Only I drew her ire. This is no way to have a marriage, and as miserable as it was for me, it was just as frustrating and unsatisfying for Loretta, too, I'm sure. How could it not have been? For some bizarre reason, we brought out the worst in each other. The strangest thing of all was that after we divorced in the mid-1980s, we got along fine. We no longer argued. Whenever we met, it was cordial and it was genuine. We caught each other up on news about the kids and the extended family, and actually had a decent relationship. I once got an insight into how we tended to be polar opposites. Someone who knew both of us said to me, "Loretta's game is to be contrary to you in any and all matters." He then said that if I remarked, "Gee, it's a nice day," Loretta would immediately jump in with, "Now, Ron, it's not that nice, and you know it." Then he instructed me in how to see this dynamic for myself. Sometime later, Loretta and I were talking, and I brought up a point about something, an opinion that I don't remember now. Loretta immediately took an opposing stance. We continued talking, and about 10 minutes later I brought up the subject again, this time taking the perspective that Loretta had taken the first time. She immediately countered it by taking up and asserting my original point. That sums up our nearly 30 years of marriage. Perhaps the bottom line is that we both wanted different things out of life. The strife between us never seemed to interfere with our relationships with our kids, however. Both of us loved them equally for the individuals they were. All the kids were active, Denise and Lori with their dancing, and Ronnie and Dave with sports. Despite his small size, David was strong. I used to lift him up so he could grab hold of the molding atop a doorway, and he could hang there by his fingers, even as a toddler. When Dave was young, he was a good kid around the house. He had a great sense of humor, and we pulled a lot of pranks together. One time I got him up on the garage. He was wearing a pair of my red Speedo swim trunks with newspapers stuffed in them so they'd stay up, hiking boots, one of Loretta's wigs, and a kite that looked like a Batman cape, and he was holding a toilet plunger pointed toward the sky. We took a photograph of him and gave it a caption of "Super Geek." He loved doing goofy stuff like that and went along eagerly. In addition, he was a very smart kid in school and a good talker, extroverted and willing to state his viewpoint. At home, David was subject to the discipline of his mother and me. In school, however, things were different. There, he was a wise-ass who had the habit of taking verbal pot shots at the other kids. Eventually, the other kid would tire of the abuse and try to put a stop to it, which apparently resulted in what David wanted all along, a fight. Ordinarily, the smaller kids are the ones who are bullied. In David's case, that was not always so. Often, he came home with tales of a scrape he had been in that day. Another negative trait that he seemed to possess early on was a habit of denigrating other people. He would come home from school complaining about other kids. It became almost a regular occurrence. He'd walk in the door and begin griping about something a kid had done or someone he had a problem with. Though I had no idea at the time this would become his signature style when he took charge of Scientology many years later. As a father, though, I supported all my kids unconditionally and was invariably protective of them. That is probably why I never bothered to look too deeply into that red flag waving wildly during David's childhood. It is a characteristic I became all too familiar with later on. Ronnie told me that he has been in 4 fistfights in his entire life, and 3 of them involved protecting his little brother from situations that Dave had instigated.